All right, let's go ahead and get started. For those of you in the East, good afternoon. Those of you on the West Coast, good morning. I hope that everyone is well. Welcome to the 10th webinar and small group discussion in the OITE series on the mental health and wellness of biomedical researchers. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Sharon Milgram, and I direct the Office of Intramural Training and Education. And beyond introducing the speaker and making a few comments now, I won't have much to say, but what I have to say at the outset, I think is really important. So last summer, maybe in August, I had a meeting with two of the OITE wellness advisors, Annie Shiner and Lori Mcnulty. And I said something vague like, I think we need to be talking more about mental health and wellness. And I think especially important, we need trainees and students and staff and faculty and institutional leaders to all be having the same discussions. And I didn't really have much of an idea of what I meant by that comment, but Annie and Lori spent some time thinking about it. They came back to me with some ideas. The OITE staff members and especially members of the OITE wellness team helped me refine those ideas further. And it led to a series that started in October and that ends today. And that is a monthly webinar on an aspect of mental health and well-being with a particular focus and spin on helping people in the biomedical research community understand and work with the material. So I want to start by thanking Annie and Lori for making this happen. While they didn't give all of the talks, they gave a lot of the talks. They also wrote nearly every one of the discussion guides, and they have been, for me, really important sounding boards. I also want to thank all of the speakers, the individuals who organize specific sessions, facilitators from multiple organizations in the Metro DC area who gave time to lead the small groups, who sent me long emails with ideas, their thoughts in follow-up. People's enthusiasm has been really meaningful to me. In the OITE, I want to acknowledge Jen Wiggins and the rest of the OITE wellness team who has put a lot of energy into talking with me about the material, promoting the work, helping trainees access the resources they need, and at times stepping up to lead the groups and stepping up to lead the sessions. I also want to acknowledge Jackie Newell Hunt and Patty Wagner. Patty for putting the webpage together and making sure that everybody had information, and Jackie for coordinating all of the logistics. I think that I probably throw at Jackie and Patty a new idea a week. It always takes work on their part, and they usually just smile and make it work. Finally, I want to acknowledge that I wondered whether this would work. I wondered if people would come. I wondered if they would have open conversations about mental health. There is so much stigma around these topics. We are asking people to do something really courageous and open. People came to share their own experiences. They also came to learn how to support colleagues and family members and friends that they care about. And so I also, in my list of thank yous, would like to thank those of you who've come to multiple sessions, whether this is your first or you've attended many of them. This is a part of the culture change we really, really need in science, to have open conversations about the health and wellness of our community. Today, we're going to wrap up by talking about welcoming colleagues on the autism spectrum. At the end, Lori's going to put up a few resources, and she's going to show a book called Far From the Tree, which was a book that I read many, many years ago. And I have to say that it really drove my thinking about neurodiversity and about slowing down my thoughts about autism and appreciating the incredible strength and power of neurodiversity in the community and in work groups. So I hope that today we can explore some of those concepts of strengths that the neurodiverse community brings to us all, and that we can talk openly about ways that we make sure we really leverage all of those strengths. Like every one of these, we will take some questions at the end. Today, we're going to try a new model and leave a little bit of extra time for questions. And then we'll take a quick break, hop on another Zoom for people who want to discuss the material in small groups. Typically, a lot of people say they're coming to the groups and don't come. These are aspirational activities. It would be so good to do this. I'll sign up. And then we get busy. And I know there's a lot on everybody's plate, but I hope that you find the time to join us with the small groups. So with that, let me introduce Lori Chaikin-Mcnulty, one of the OITE wellness advisors. She is a clinical social worker. She has done a lot of work in the neurodiversity community, working with clients, helping us at NIH make our environment more welcoming. And I'm glad to introduce her today.
Thanks, Sharon. Like Sharon said, I am an OIT wellness advisor, and I'm really happy to be able to talk about autism in the biomedical field today. So I want to start with the definition of neurodiversity. So the definition is here for you, but the basic gist is that there are a lot of normal variation, right, within the human spectrum, and that we shouldn't be stigmatized or excluded in any way if you're not part of sort of what's neurotypical. And I think that this is a really important point. And the reason that I bring it up today, right, in the autism talk, is that we know that autism is neurologically based. So differences in the way that the brain operates. And typically we hear the word neurodiversity around autism, around ADHD. And like Sharon was saying, what I would really like to get across today is that neurodiversity is strength. Seeing things in a different way, having different points of view, different ways that our brain works. We need that in science. And figuring out a way to sort of collaborate and create a space where those strengths can be best harnessed, and figuring out how do I address the barriers to accessing those strengths, that's really important. So I want to just sort of start with that idea and sort of getting everyone on the same page of neurodiversity as a strength. I also appreciate that at this talk today, there's a great amount of neurodiversity. You might be somebody who is on the autism spectrum, identifies as having autism, or you might be somebody who suspects, or you might be someone who works with somebody who suspects or has identified as having autism, or you might be someone who doesn't have any personal experience but wants to learn about it. So this talk is really, hopefully, wherever you are in your neurodiversity, you'll get some information. I think that this is particularly important to that last point, which is, we tend, I think, historically to say, well, if you're neurodiverse, you need to figure out ways to adapt to the environment. But it can't all fall on the individual to change. We need to shift and change the environment, our expectations, interpersonal relationships. It also can't all fall on the environment to change. So this is a pretty critical interplay, is that individuals shouldn't be doing all of the changing and the environment shouldn't be doing all of the changing. Is that hopefully we'll figure out some ways together, and probably particularly in the small groups, problem solve and to really think about how do you balance and how do you integrate both individuals shifting and collaborating and adapting, and the environment shifting and collaborating and adapting as well. So this is really an important point for me. I used to work in a center for autism at a hospital. We used to say, when you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. So I may say things about being on the spectrum, and that might not be true for you or for someone you know. These are diagnostic indicators and things that we tend to see, but really just like each of us, it's not a surprise, we're each unique and things present in different ways. So I'm going to try to avoid sort of making sweeping statements, but just know that these are sort of trends we see. So to start off, I'm just going to talk a little bit about even the diagnostic criteria for the DSM-5. What is autism spectrum disorder? And we'll talk a little bit, I mean, the further away from it we get from the DSM-4 to the DSM-5, the less relevant it becomes, but people still ask about, well, what about Asperger's and things like that? We're going to talk about the changes from the last DSM to this DSM, but that was, early 2010s, so it becomes a little less relevant, but it's still important to address. So the idea is that autism spectrum disorder is this combination of challenges in social communication and social interactions and restricted or repetitive patterns of behavior, restricted interests. And that sensory needs may or may not be present. It appears early on in development and throughout development, and that it gets in the way at times, especially as we think about that the world tends to be set up for neurotypical people, that it can get in the way of school or work or social interactions or other really important domains. So this is the combination. We're going to talk about both the social communication and interaction, as well as restricted interests and repetitive behavior. So this is sort of a summary from the DSM to think about what are challenges in social communication and social interaction. We all at times experience these, but this is a little bit different, right? This is challenges in reciprocity, so that back and forth conversation. And as I'm reading through these, think about like, how might this impact you in a biomedical field? We're going to talk specifically about in a lab environment or in a biomedical environment, how you might see these things appear. But you could think about how if there's challenges in reciprocity or even in sharing information, differences in how you share information, you can see how that could impact someone in the biomedical field, or could impact you in the biomedical field. Challenges in responding to or starting social interactions and conversations, and also very literal thinking. So you're going to hear me say the words implicit and explicit a lot. There's a lot of struggles with implicit, like not quite exactly defined, but very literal thinking. Limitations in the nonverbal communications are the subtleties. So tones, eye contact, body language, facial expressions, things that are not exactly spelled out, but someone who's neurotypical may pick up, oh, they're frustrated, they have that tone. Someone who is on the spectrum, that might be more of a challenge. So the difficulty in sort of those nonverbal communications and understanding those inherently. Difficulties in relationships, so like developing and maintaining relationships. So you could imagine that if there's struggles in sort of picking up on nonverbal cues or reciprocity, that you might have a harder time in maintaining relationships, but also modifying behavior, right? So if you're in a room with somebody and they're typing and they're right in the middle of an email and you're not necessarily picking up that, hey, they're busy and they're not really wanting to talk to me because they're not telling you, they're just showing you, that could be hard, right? For you don't know how to modify your behavior because you're not picking up on the cues that the other person thinks that they're giving you. Also, I think typically we think about people on the spectrum, oh, well, they don't have a strong desire to connect with other people. And in my work across the years, I've actually found that is often not true, that often there's a strong desire to connect, but the lack of skills get in the way of connecting. There's certainly some people who don't have as strong of a desire to connect, but oftentimes I feel like you keep yearning to connect in professional relationships, in friendships, and romantic relationships, but the lack of skill and the confusion can get in the way there. Again, these are examples. It's not a comprehensive list. So this is I told you I'd sort of talk about the switch from the DSM-4 to the DSM-5. So we have a couple of things. Asperger's is no longer given as a diagnosis. If you have an Asperger's diagnosis, you can get that diagnosis, obviously, and that's not sort of going away if that's part of something that you were diagnosed with as a during the DSM-4, but now it's all integrated as one larger autism spectrum disorder. That's probably the key one, and also adding of sensory criteria. So it's now everything is sort of consolidated down into autism spectrum disorder, and we talk about different levels of need. So level 1 requiring less support to level 3 requiring very substantial support in each social communication and restricting repetitive behaviors. Common co-occurrences. I think it's really important. So those are the core things that we think about when we think about autism and the neurodiversity in autism, but there are often common co-occurrences that we see that's important to keep in mind. So sleep issues can come up. There is correlation, higher rates of seizures in those with autism, GI concerns, immune dysfunctions, sensory needs we talked about. Language processing can be present differently, both in expressive and receptive, and as well as executive functioning needs. And there's a whole other talk on executive functioning needs. And motor skills, both fine motor and gross motor skills. And when you look at a 6-month-old who then later goes on to be diagnosed with autism, the very first thing we see is challenges in motor skills. So all things to think about. And mental health needs. So this is a really important piece of information. This is a study from 2017. And obviously, so that doesn't even cover, COVID-19 concerns, but that research is showing in larger scale studies that 54 to 70% of people who have autism who also have one or more mental health conditions. So this is really, really important to think about, that there's an increased risk for suicide and also an increased occurrence of gender diversity. Diversity in gender identity, not binary, and transgender. So thinking about this, right, there's a lot that's going on, and it's critical to sort of think about whole people and not just the particular behaviors of people, right? And if you are on the spectrum, we're thinking about your whole self and getting support for your whole being and your mental health as well. So this is an important point to sort of think about. This is an invisible difference. And we used to say an invisible disability, but I really prefer the terms of, right, it's an invisible difference, right? You can't look at somebody and see that often. So part of neurodiversity of ASD means having a different style of interacting and communicating with other people, right? That's part of the diversity of this. And anytime, in any circumstance where there's differences in communication and differences in socialization styles, there is the potential for miscommunication, for misunderstanding, for frustration. So there is the potential for that. And so this could be particularly challenging. Could be a particularly challenging domain, right? When you are on the spectrum and you're working with others who maybe aren't understanding your neurodiversity, or if you are working with someone who's neurodiverse and there's just differing styles. So this is a pretty critical thing, is not to give an armchair diagnosis. Don't look at someone's behaviors and say, oh, well, they must have autism. That's not appropriate and not helpful. Don't overstep your boundaries and over ask and invade other people's right to disclose what they do and don't want to. And we're going to talk about self-disclosure at the end. There are often, we hear about microaggressions, particularly, using someone's label to refer to them. So being really careful about microaggressions in this space. And just because, someone is expressing certain behavior, don't make assumptions about diagnosis. Don't make assumptions about intent or interest or caring or personality, right? The whole intent of this is to think about, what are the strengths? How can we access those strengths? And how can we work in a collaborative manner? So we have to be really careful about all of these things. If you are feeling frustrated or overwhelmed, which happens, right? There are differences in communication, there are differences in social styles. It can get frustrating, right? Diversity inherently is wonderful and needed and brings a lot of strengths, but diversity can also bring frustration as we work to collaborate together. So I think it's really important to take care of yourself. Have a plan if you're getting frustrated, first and foremost, to be able to take a break, to be able to walk away, to be able to cool down, because we can't really get anything done when we're angry, when we're frustrated, when we're feeling like this isn't working. Have a plan to take a break. And if you need to, have a script for exiting situation. I'm sorry, I'm feeling like this isn't really productive right now. Can we talk again tomorrow? And you can repeat that again and again if the other person, right, doesn't feel productive right now. Can we talk again another day? And then have a plan for re-entering the conversation. And often that starts with getting support. So processing with other people who are trusted and reliable, decide what it is that you want to get across in that conversation and the course of action, how you might get that across, and determine your role, right? If you are at the top, if you're a PI versus if you're a postbac or if you're a staff scientist, what is your role in sort of creating a collaborative environment? And think about, are there informal supports? Do I need someone that I can talk to about this? Or are there formal supports? Are there institutional supports for you? And really the key in this is that you want to respond instead of react. Responding is, this is frustrating to me. I need to make a choice about how I want to handle this situation, rather than I'm frustrated, so I'm just going to react. And when I'm feeling in the moment, and making a plan for follow-up later along the line. So there are a lot of strengths, and this is not a comprehensive list by any means, but I just want to point out some of the strengths that I tend to see. Differing points of view and new ideas. Neurodiversity comes with different ways of seeing things and thinking about things. Strength in logic, strong desire. When there is a intense passion, right, that restricted interest, when there's an intense passion, often for any of us, we get really excited and curious about learning about it and growing our knowledge in that interest and that capacity to focus. It can be really helpful if you're really super passionate about one small area of science that you make a difference in. It can be really helpful to focus intently and for long hours on that. The structure and routine and clarity and rules that come with protocols can be really helpful. There's strong learning styles. People may know about Temple Grandin, who is a professor, and she revolutionized the cattle industry. And I've heard her talk, and she says, in that talk, she said, my brain works like Google Images. The visual learning, and there's a movie about her called Thinking in Pictures, visual learning that she had helped her create an entire new system. Detail-oriented and experience in using support systems. So especially now, people are being diagnosed younger and younger, and you're able to access support. So there is some experience in using your support systems, because oftentimes when you get a diagnosis, especially when you're younger, there's a host of doctors and therapists and community building and groups and school supports. So having experience in using support systems, we know, is a big strength. There's often a strong memory for preferred interests, and also you may have a lot of empathy. And I think that sometimes people get confused and they say, oh, well, people on the spectrum struggle with empathy. And that can be true for some people to an extent. There's cognitive empathy, which is sort of understanding and being empathic to what someone's thinking, versus affective, which is empathy for what someone's feeling. And again, I'll hear people tell me, when there are emotions in the room, even if I'm not totally sure why they're there, I feel like a sponge. So I actually think my experience is working with people on the spectrum tell me that often that there's an incredibly strong affective empathy, and often there's a strong sense of morality of what's fair and just, which can be really a huge strength. So successful scientists develop skills in a multitude of areas. This is by no means comprehensive, but it's important to think about scientific work, professionalism, social and collaborative interactions, navigating changes in work-life balance. And so I'm going to go through a little bit and talk about what are the potential barriers that we might see, and barriers to accessing strengths in each one of these domains. And then we're going to talk about creating a positive work environment. And when I talk about the barriers, I'm going to talk about individual barriers that we may experience, as well as environmental barriers, because if you remember that cycle in the beginning, it's all critical. We need to do sort of both. We need to think about both ourselves and the environment. So in scientific work, if you're thinking about some of the things that might get in the way, so executive functioning challenges. So, if you think about emotion regulation or planning or organizing or impulse control or transitions, that can be challenging in scientific work, as well as rigidity. in routines or thinking. So if you're working on a project and you're really feeling like the experiment has to go a certain way, and it can be really hard to adapt or change or flex if that project isn't working, or if the funding goes somewhere else, or you don't get the funding that you were thinking you would get for that particular project, right? It can become hard with the rigidity and inflexibility at times. Splinter skills is also something, basically the idea that we can understand something, but sometimes it can be hard to understand the context of it. So like, I know I'm doing this experiment and I'm really focused on the details of this, but maybe I'm not looking at the bigger picture, or how it fits into the work of the larger lab, or what it is that we're going to be doing with this next. Those splinter skills, you can see, can be challenging, as well as, some areas we have great strength and some great weakness. Although I think probably you would look at this list and you would think, wow, this applies to a lot of people, as well as sensory needs. So again, imagine that you're trying to analyze data and you can see the lights flashing in front of you, or the smells are so much that you feel nauseous every time you walk into the next to the wet bench, right? So sensory needs can also be present barriers in accessing the strengths. For the environment, go with the flow environments without explicit expectations. That can be really hard. So we know that routines and structure and rules and clarity can be really helpful, because picking up on nuances that aren't talked about can be really challenging. So really go with the flow environments that don't have any structure can present as a challenge, because like, what am I even supposed to do here? But also really inflexible environments. So if we talked about how adaptation can be hard and flexibility can be hard. Well, so think about then if you're in a lab where you're thinking one way, the lab is thinking another way, and no one is willing to be flexible or bend, that can present a big challenge in scientific work. Physical disorganization, like really not having any kind of order to the freezer, or everyone's stuff is everywhere from their experiments and the wet bench is covered in things, that can also present a really big challenge. And lack of clear instruction, this is what we expect you to do. And we'll talk about ways, obviously, to modify all of these things and to think about these things differently so we can access the strengths. The other thing can be in scientific work, changes in project directions or setbacks, like I said, right? If you think about difficulty with transitions and rigidity, that can be hard when a project changes or you get a big setback in your scientific work, which we know happens a lot. And professionalism, which is also sort of, I think, professionalism and social collaboration, they kind of go hand in hand. But if you think about if it's hard to pick up on social cues or contextual understanding, especially in a place where there's lots of implicit culture, think about how hard that could be, right? Somebody says to you, I just feel like, it's harder for me to hear new ideas early in the morning. I'm just not a morning person. Well, I pick up, okay, well, now I need to not, if I have a big thing that I want to tell them that I'm trying to get them to do, even if it's not a good time for me, maybe I need to stay a little late because maybe they're more of an evening person. But if you don't pick up on the cues or the contextual understanding of like, maybe if you have a big idea presented in the evening, then maybe 8 a.m. is the best time for you. And so you do it anyways. And then you feel like, why are they always saying no to my ideas? Or why are they always late to my meetings? So thinking about contextual cues and understanding, you could see how that could feel like challenging in a professional environment. Again, I think a lot of these things kind of go again and again, but you can see how they impact. I put them all in each category because they can impact across domains of building your skills as a scientist. So again, sensory needs and executive functioning challenges. But also, I think an important thing of environment here is we talked about lab cultures with a lot of implicit culture and implicit expectations. We talked about that. Also, work environments of high emotional tension. If we go back to that idea that there's high affect, there can be high affective empathy. There's a lot of tension. People, if you're on the spectrum, you might find like that you feel that. And maybe you sort of see where it's coming from and maybe you don't, but that can be a really big challenge. as well as implicit or confusing hierarchical structure. So it's rare that we sit down and we say, okay, well, this is the hierarchy and this is who you go to, but really on this occasion, you would go to that person. I mean, think about all of the different dynamics in any workplace. Hierarchical structure has its formal structure, but there's always a sort of an underlying implicit informal structure, right? Of who does what and who do you go to for what and who gets more work and things like that. And so those implicit structures can feel really confusing. Now we have, this is a long list, but now we have some barriers to strengths, accessing strengths when it comes to social and collaborative interactions. And, you know, this might be the one that's most, I want to say, most felt by us, because communication and social interactions often are the things that tend to frustrate us a good bit in labs and in the biomedical field, and really in most work environments. So if you think about theory of mind challenges, so theory of mind is the idea that I know that something is different is happening in my mind than is happening in your mind. So if you think about, like, we don't all have the same amount of details, or we don't all have the same path that we think that we're going down. And so theory of mind, we really have to explicitly discuss, you know, what is the plan here? And what do you know? And what do I know? And getting on the same page. And it's not so often that we do that and we have those explicit discussions. So theory of mind can get in the way and be a challenge. Understanding other people's intentions or perspectives differing from your own, that can be a challenge, especially if you're feeling particularly stuck or not flexible. So difficulty understanding other people's perspectives and intentions can be a challenge. Also feeling outside or other. And this sort of goes to the next one with the history of difficulty with social interactions. If you're on the spectrum, you may have the experience that for a long time in your life, you felt other or outside, or like I hear this a lot, like everyone else has a rule book that I just don't have, that I have to learn, that I have to work hard to learn. And so if you're already coming into an environment with that kind of history, that can be, you know, sort of hard to integrate, especially if you're feeling like, okay, everyone in this lab sort of has their thing going on and I'm not really sure what it is. May come across blunt or uninterested or even rude, right? So that can happen, I think, with a lot of different communication styles, but the driver, sort of more direct, more straightforward, someone who is on the spectrum may tend toward that type of communication style. And so, you know, that's why we have to be really careful about interpreting, you know, what people's intentions are. Hidden social rules, it's sort of a lot of what I've already been talking about, but the idea of hidden social rules are all these things that we don't ever explicitly talk about, and nobody ever sort of explicitly explains to us. We just know that they're social rules. So I may know that if I'm going into a meeting with my boss, I want to maybe comb my hair, look a certain way, dress a certain way, act a certain way, send something, you know, be more formal than I would with a colleague. Well, no one ever like sat down and explained that to me. It's just sort of a hidden social rule. The same thing with technology, right? An email. I maybe the first couple of times I email my boss, I email them and I am very, very formal. And then we go back and forth and I realize, hey, that person's not so formal, so I can send informal emails. No one ever said to me, hey, after the 5th email, if they don't, you know, address it formally, you can switch to informal. It's just something that I noticed. It's a hidden social rule, but these things are hidden. So again, they're implicit, which maybe makes it more challenging if we're not explicitly discussing those rules. Subtlety and nuance is sort of all part of that hidden social rules. If I walk into somebody's office and they're, like I said, they're typing an email, or I notice somebody's right in the middle of an experiment, you notice someone's right in the middle of an experiment, you might not rush to interrupt them, especially if they're sort of physically turning away from you, but without picking up on those cues, it might be challenging to realize, okay, this maybe isn't a good time. Not sharing about work in an expected manner. We talked about not sharing information in the same way. So you are expecting, oh, well, when you're done with that experiment, you'll just come to me without maybe asking. And then again, it's too implicit. So thinking about environmental cues, unpredictable interactions, toxic work environments, and implicit or confusing hierarchical structure, right? You can see that social interactions and collaborative interactions might be really challenging if there's no predictability in it. Okay, I don't really know how the mood that someone's going to be in today, or I'm not really sure who am I supposed to be reporting to today, or I finished that experiment, what do I have to do next, right? The unpredictability of environments can be really hard, especially if they're toxic and challenging. Navigating changes. Again, this gets a little, I think this part gets a little bit repetitive, right? But you can see how these different challenges, both environmental challenges and individual challenges, can impact multiple areas of scientific work. So navigating changes, anxiety and uncertainty and changes in work and emotional processing and other executive functioning issues, that means changing your work or navigating a setback would be really hard. For environment, something we haven't talked about is like maybe rapidly changing labs or high turnover, or something all of a sudden happens, right? Like somebody leaves the lab unexpectedly or someone gets ill unexpectedly. That can be a particularly hard transition or change. So keep that in mind. And then finally, work-life integration. So given the comorbid mental health and biomedical issues, right, that can be really hard, trying to manage all of that and integrating that with your work life integration and balancing those things. Experiencing familial or social stressors and also rigid interests may tip the balance in one direction or another. So if you're super passionately interested in something and you end up in the lab for 18 hours, right? Then you realize, oh, like I actually am not hanging out or seeing people outside of lab in the same way I wanted to, or creating that outside of lab work life integration. Also, from an environmental perspective, the implicit nature of unclear expectations about work-life balance from supervisors, right? You might have one person who says, oh, we don't really go on vacations in this lab, and another person that says, well, forget that. I take vacations because I need to take care of myself. Well, now what do I do? It can be really confusing. So some unpredictability or unclear expectations or differences in beliefs can feel challenging. So there are ways to support a positive work environment. And I tried to write these both, if you are somebody who's seeking support and you're seeking environmental adaptations and you think, okay, there's some things that I need from this lab to help me, or if you notice there's some people in my lab who might benefit from these supports. I tried to write this in a way that, it can be used no matter where you are in the neurodiversity spectrum. So clear expectations. I think that I've sort of said it again and again and throughout the barriers, but clear expectations, quantifiable tasks, timelines, making explicit plans that are broken down, clarifying daily expectations, but also long-term goals. I need to get this experiment done, but this is in service of this other larger thing. Allowing time for processing. I think a lot of times, especially, if you have a really fast auditory processing speed, you're like, okay, I got it, we're good, let's go, right? But you might need a longer processing time if you're on the spectrum and figuring out how to say, can I think about this and can I get back to you? And creating clear boundaries and clear rules. So clarity, I feel like, is a big one when we're talking about creating supports. So either figuring out sort of how do I ask for those things? How do I explicitly discuss these things? Or how can I sort of break down what I'm asking for from someone else into clear timelines, clear goals? Explicitly discussing lab culture, which may be hard and uncomfortable, right? Because it might not be something you've ever explicitly talked about before. Well, technically this is the person who does all the ordering, but as it turns out, this other person tends to do a lot more of the ordering, right? It might not be something that you ever really thought about or talked about. It might not be something that we're clear on in our own minds, but spending some time discussing lab culture, or hey, listen, As it turns out, like no one really does that well in the afternoon. So we do better in the morning. Clarifying hierarchy, who do you go to? And potentially even creating a safe alliance with a lab member. So if there are questions or you're confused or feeling overwhelmed by something, having an alliance, safe alliance with a lab member with boundaries, right? Because we don't want to feel like too stretched by, we don't want to spend too much time with that. So setting clear boundaries around that, but to say, okay, this is a person I can ask about this is a person I can ask about that. So creating alliances, so you feel like you can go to people and ask questions. Creating routines, also offering and seeking regular feedback and support. So it's not just let me talk about all of these things and make them explicit and now you got it, but it's saying, okay, it really helps me if we have a meeting every 2 weeks. Can we have a certain time? And that will help with boundaries too of, okay, we'll talk about that thing in our meeting. Developing and implementing executive function aids. Does that mean I make a list and before I leave the lab every night, I need to check off, okay, I cleaned off my whip bench, I put my groceries in the freezer, whatever it is, creating a list. Or with difficulty with transitions, do I need a timer that's set 15 minutes before I need to start moving to the next thing? And discussing challenges and flexibility. If something's going to change, instead of saying, okay, well, that didn't work out, so let's move on, thinking about it. What was that? What frustrations do we have? What do we need to help move forward to the next thing? The other supports that I have listed here are sort of really making sure that you play to each person's strengths and that there might be differences in communication between parties. And this may require external support. But I think we often end up in a dangerous situation when we try to convince that other people that we're right instead of trying to find a collaboration that we can agree on. And if you think about differences in flexibility, it can be really hard to get out of, no, this is the way that it needs to be done and move towards collaboration, which is why sometimes we need external supports. For sensory needs, thinking about what sensory needs might you need support with? Are there quiet areas? Are there more dim areas? Are there places to take a break? Are you the kind of person that has to say, listen, I don't want you to think I'm not working, but every 10 minutes of every hour, I need to get up and take some laps, or I'm listening to my earphones or my earpods. It's not because I'm not paying attention, it's because it helps me focus. Prioritizing areas of improvement, I feel like this is a lot of different things. So saying, okay, this time, this meeting, I really want to talk about this one thing. So making sure that you're not feeling overwhelmed with the amount of things that you're shifting and adapting to. Modifying work schedule if you're somebody who has sleep issues, or if you need to go and get professional support, if you're someone who goes to therapy, if you're somebody who, as it turns out, like the evenings are much better, are there modifications that can be made for work schedules? Again, I think a lot of these are sort of like repeats, but they're repeats because they affect so many areas of our work and development. Accessing additional supports if you need it. So maybe that means colleagues and trusted supports, but it can also mean institutional resources. If you're feeling like, okay, this is a lot and I need some help here. And also having a plan to manage frustrations like we talked about. The last little bit before we get into questions and we'll move to groups is self-disclosure. So the first slide I have on this is thinking about if you're choosing to self-disclose, and the next slide is if someone self-discloses to you. And I want to say before I talk about any of this that this is context dependent. It depends on your situation. And we're going to get there, but oftentimes we need help making these decisions and we need to think things through out loud, even if we're not seeking advice, just to have a sounding board. So it is context dependent whether or not you choose to self-disclose. So it is not a requirement. You do not have to self-disclose. So let me be clear about that. When you are self-disclosing, think about sharing what you need to share. not less and not more. So not giving someone every single piece of information and every single piece of data about you, but not giving them so little that they're not really sure even what you're talking about or what you're trying to share with them. So before you do this, observe lab culture. Now, I realize I just spent a long time talking about how observation and social cues is a challenge, but if we can sort of pull back and think of this as data and say, like, what happens when other people share things? Or what's the kind of vibe? What's the emotional temperature in the lab? And if this is particularly challenging for you, maybe this is where support can come in really handy. So you might notice, okay, well, somebody last month said that they needed to leave early because they had a personal appointment, and everyone's like, oh yeah, sure, no problem, go take an hour. Well, that might feel really safe. But if everyone went ugh and rolled their eyes, look for those things and say, oh, okay, you know what, that might not be the safest thing to do, safest place to share. So addressing and assessing these with external support. So it could be a colleague, institutional support, it could be a mental health professional, it could be your family or friends, and having people sort of help you think through the risks and the safety of sharing can be really useful. I think it's important to script and practice what you want to say and have clear asks. What is it that you're trying to get across? Because when we're nervous and we go into a situation, then, you know, we can sort of have more clarity when we think about what it is that we want to ask and what we want to tell people and what we want them to know. So scripting and practicing is really useful. Also understanding what's in and out of your control. I think oftentimes when we share things with people, we have an idea of how they're going to respond. And how other people respond is not within our control. That's why we do the pre-work to sort of assess, is this the right environment to share? But what is in our control is what we choose to share and how we choose to say what we want to say. And then request follow-up. Now, this isn't a one-time conversation. This is something that can be followed up on. The other side of that, right, is responding to self-disclosure. So I didn't put this on here, but first, look what your emotions are. Are you anxious? Are you worried you're going to say the wrong thing? Are you thinking about someone else that you know? Take a deep breath and ground yourself and sort of try really hard to, okay, I'm having these emotions. I'm going to try to respond to the person that's in front of me. And just say, thank you so much for sharing with me. Appreciate that that takes a lot of courage to share that kind of a thing. And then you can communicate about it. What can I do to support you? You know, is there anything that you want me to know about how you best work? Can we make a plan so we can best work together? And then you ask about follow-up. Can we meet again on next day? Don't ask about the diagnosis specifically. Don't sort of ignore it and say, okay, well, that's fine. We're all the same here. And let's get back to science, right? Really acknowledge that this is something that's really important. Don't share it with other people, especially in that person's network, especially without their consent, right? So there's some questions about, I'm going to keep this confidential. Please let me know if there's others that can inform. And don't overstep your own roles and your own boundaries, and get support when you need it. So there are safe and effective ways to get help. I think this is an important slide in every one of these mental health. You know, I think that institutional resources can be really useful, sort of no matter where you are in neurodiversity, and as you're thinking about collaborating and adapting. Obviously, you know, I'm a therapist, so I think therapy can be a really useful place to discuss things in a sort of a safe, supportive, non-judgmental way, especially if it comes to like, who do I need to tell what? Having a therapist to sort of think that through and collect that observational data and support you is really, can be really useful. And for those additional mental health needs that we talked about, sort of no matter who you are, sort of talking with your primary care physician or your psychiatrist can be helpful as you try to navigate this and support yourself. There's some resources, and also, as Sharon said, some reading that you might want to look into. And I appreciate everyone's attention, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Lori. So I want to start by acknowledging some of the messages that we received from participants expressing their disappointment in the Autism Speaks community. And I think people should just be heard in that regard. I don't know if you want to make some comments about that. Or maybe we should just acknowledge and consider different sources. But I think it's important to honor the input.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
Then what I'd like to do is turn to some questions. And I want to start, there's a really long set of questions. And I just want to pull one part out of this, and maybe we'll use some of the other parts as we also go through some questions. And it talks about reframing or rephrasing autistic differences to place less emphasis on negative aspects. And it goes on to say, how can we include conversation about how it's not always the autistic person having trouble, but rather neurotypicals being unyielding with their communication styles and with their expectations and not accepting difference. And I think it is really that crystallizes a lot of the questions about how do we change the dialogue around autism in the workplace in general, or autism in the community in general. And I just, you know, that was struck me as it's true. We're all pretty inflexible at times, right? We all get sort of caught in our ways. And if you have any thoughts about how one can have a good conversation with someone about their inflexibility to neurodiverse people in the group.
Yeah, this is a really tough one. I actually thought about this a good bit as I was writing this, and this is a hard one to sort of capture, but the very first thing I always recommend is monitoring your emotions before we have discussions about inflexibility, because as we are frustrated, as we are anxious, as we are feeling overwhelmed, we become less flexible, all of us. And so monitoring, having those conversations, I think has to start with monitoring our frustrations and making sure that we're having those conversations in a time and place where we're not super overwhelmed and not super frustrated. I also think, it depends on the safety of your lab and the safety of the situation, but having open conversations with people about, these are the challenges that I'm having. I notice that, you know, also these are the challenges in collaboration. You don't necessarily want to say, hey, I notice you're being really inflexible, right? But just sort of noticing like, hey, listen, this is something that's getting in the way of our work. This is something that's getting in the way of your collaboration. I feel like it should be this way. I'm wondering how you feel like it should be. Do you think it's somewhere in between? So really like labeling the issue and not labeling the person. You're so inflexible or you're not tolerant, and really labeling what is the issue that we're facing and how is that getting in the way, and having for you some clear asks about what it is that you think should be different, having clear asks about what would be helpful for you, and trying to get together to a point where you can say, okay, I noticed that this isn't working. We've got to fix the issue, rather than you're inflexible and you're not tolerating, and labeling the entire person.
Yeah, so I want to go flip to the other side now. There's a comment by somebody who's a supervisor saying it feels overwhelming to try to accommodate the various needs of different individuals in the group. And it's not something that comes easy to everyone, even to those who want to be inclusive. It's just, we learn science skills and not necessarily people skills. And whether you have thoughts on ways that supervisors can initiate conversations. And then I'm going to ask you to wait 1 minute because I want to address one other thing here. They go on to say, it feels like if we reach out to an office on campus, we're escalating this to a problem, and we don't want to do that. And I guess I just, before we talk about what individuals can do, would like to point out that we probably, as a community, we need to really work to debunk that myth. because none of us are experts in everything, and seeking resources and support from someone who can help can be the difference between a not so good outcome and good outcome. And rather than you addressing that, if you could just talk about, in talking to trainees, regardless of their difference, talking to trainees who've had a good outcome with their PI or supervisor or boss, what did that person do that stood out for you?
I think that the biggest thing that I see that's helpful is that one line of respond instead of react. If you take time to think through what is helpful for you, and you have clear asks, and you know what's frustrating, and you can anticipate, okay, this might be frustrating for me, how I'm going to handle that, taking some time to respond instead of react generally leads to much better outcomes. The other thing that leads to outcomes is getting external support. So not trying to handle it all on your own, but getting external support. And I think that the initial question of, it can feel really overwhelming is, you're right, this is not a simple or easy thing, right? This is something that we need to start talking about and start thinking about. And maybe for all trainees, saying, what's the best way that you learn? What are some things that, help you feel supported? Maybe having that as sort of upon entry into a lab as just sort of a normalized conversation, and sort of having follow-ups like that as a normalized conversation, knowing that it's not going to be perfect and that people are going to feel frustrated and they are going to feel like, okay, I need this or I need that differently. And that you might not be able to accommodate every single one, but that normalizing having those discussions and sort of not avoiding it and saying, okay, well, it's just not working, so let's just keep going.
And I think not only being willing to have them, but accepting that you might make a mistake, you might say something and wish you could take it back, that these are uncomfortable conversations because we don't have them often enough. And so I think there's some comments in the chat in response to the question. One from somebody who says, I'm one of those people, and an office is there to help and it's not escalating. It's like a great thing when somebody reaches out. And then somebody who pointed out that it might be useful when those of us on the receiving end of it ask, say, oh, but this is challenging, and how do I sort this out and have this conversation, to just realize it's log units harder for the trainee coming to us or employee coming to us. And maybe just appreciating that could help. I want to turn to a different situation, and that is your thoughts on how to navigate a situation in which communication from a neurodiverse lab member is perceived by someone else as a microaggression. That it's really a part of the communication style, but it lands as a microaggression. And especially if it's a situation where there's not been self-disclosure. So sort of how you might tease apart something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you bring up a good point, Sharon, which is these are all challenges, and that we're going to make mistakes, and that I think a big part of this process is not only learning how to adapt, but also how to repair. That there will be ruptures, there will be challenges, we're going to get frustrated, and that a big part of it is repair. So if something lands as a microaggression, figuring out maybe that means internally, and maybe that means with support, how do I make a repair there? How do I clarify, first of all, apologize and take ownership, but also make repairs? So how can I communicate? And it's, very context dependent, but how can I communicate that that's something that's hard for me and that I'm still learning that, or that, that I can go back and have a conversation. I think it's important not to say, okay, well, I'm not going to bring it up because I don't want to make it worse. I think it's important to figure out, how do we repair the situation?
Thank you. There's a comment about the drive in academia to mask things, right? We try to sort of talk around or mask over mental health issues in the community, needs of historically marginalized communities, mask autism. I mean, just fill in the blank. And that what we really need to do is start seeing these conversations perhaps as an unmasking. We're going to start trying to have these conversations, and we're going to do the best that we can with that, and appreciate that we won't always hit the mark. And in reflecting about the comments that I received about us using information from Autism Speaks, and then I also got some comments about either use the word disability, it is a disability, or don't use the word disability, right? That it is really everyone coming at these things from their unique perspectives, and maybe we should just embrace the opportunity to learn more while we navigate mistakes, and understand why for some people they are and some people they aren't. This brings me to a question that has a lot of people voted it, and I saw, and I think it's an important one, and I am a little bit nervous about asking it. And in general, I get stressed when people you don't want to say, have you looked into whether you might be? And it's not only around autism, but the question is, should we ever tell someone that they should consider looking into the possibility that they may be on the spectrum, and under what circumstances might that be appropriate, if ever?
So let me start by saying, I'm a mental health professional, and I am very careful about this, right? Even I think it's an incredibly delicate situation. It's context dependent. I would say err on the side of not doing it, especially in a professional environment. However, we do recommend that if someone is struggling, to sort of have some language to say, hey, I noticed that things are hard. Do you potentially, can we help you get some more support? And so I think that there's a way to connect people with support and connect people with resources without suggesting that they might be on the spectrum or giving a diagnostic indicator, because the truth is we have no idea what's going on in someone's life. We don't know if they have a diagnosis and they're choosing not to share it. We don't know if that's going to bring up something from their history. We don't know. And I think unless you really, really know, and you spend a lot of time knowing, which isn't your role necessarily, that's a really potentially risky thing to do. But I think we can either, one, get support for ourselves on how to manage, or two, help people get connected with resources and support, no matter what struggle that they're going through.
Right. Thank you. So we're going to go ahead and wrap up. I do want to address one last comment, and that is a question about why we didn't have a panel discussion or someone within the community talk. I will say that at the start of putting this series together, I made a tactical decision not to ask individuals to speak on behalf of groups, and to take the approach this time of bringing in people who work within the field and having small groups where people could share. I appreciate that. I've had the same question, why didn't you invite people with generalized anxiety disorder to share? Why didn't you invite people who struggle with executive function? I imagine that one could debate that decision, and I welcome your input in helping me think this through. I also see this series as the beginning of a dialogue, and I'm very, very open to people's input about that, but I will take responsibility for that decision as the person who decided what approach we would take. And to be honest, we talked about all kinds of models, including that. So we're going to continue the discussion The meeting ID is 160-655-0279. I will be there putting everybody into groups. I appreciate that people have some strong feelings about decisions that were made, and I am more than open to hearing and listening and learning. So please join us. So everybody take a moment's break. I want to thank everybody for sharing and for being open, and Lori for the presentation. Thank you, everyone.